What most people never realize is that, even as the world now remembers the atomic bombs as the dramatic end of World War II, the United States was already bracing for something far more brutal. Long before Japan surrendered, military planners were preparing for an invasion so massive and so violent that it would dwarf anything that had come before it. This wasn't speculation or political theater. It was real, detailed, and rehearsed. The unseen footage from this period captures soldiers training not for a quick victory, but for a nightmare scenario that everyone involved quietly feared. By 1945, the war in the Pacific had taught American commanders a harsh lesson. Japan did not fight like Germany. Island after island had turned into a killing ground. At places like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, Japanese forces fought almost to extinction, choosing death over surrender, while American troops paid a horrifying price for every mile gained. These battles weren't just military engagements. They were psychological warnings. If small islands could cost tens of thousands of lives, what would happen on the Japanese mainland, where the terrain was familiar, the population dense, and the defenders fully prepared? That question drove the creation of Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan. The footage shows young men training endlessly for beach landings, urban combat, and relentless resistance. These weren't clean drills meant for morale. Soldiers practiced advancing under simulated machine gun fire, clearing buildings room by room, and responding to ambushes from civilians as well as uniformed soldiers. There was an unspoken understanding that the enemy would not only be trained soldiers, but farmers, factory workers, and teenagers armed with whatever weapons they could carry. Japanese military doctrine at the time reinforced this fear. Civilians were being trained to resist invasion with bamboo spears, improvised explosives, and suicidal tactics. American intelligence knew this. The footage reflects that knowledge in its intensity. Training emphasized endurance, psychological toughness, and the expectation of constant casualties. Soldiers were conditioned to move forward even as men around them fell, because stopping would mean losing everything. This was not preparation for a traditional victory. It was preparation for survival in a war with no clear end. Casualty estimates were staggering, and although they were rarely discussed publicly, they haunted military planners. Some projections suggested hundreds of thousands of American dead, with Japanese casualties potentially reaching into the millions. Hospitals were already preparing for waves of wounded that could overwhelm the medical system. Purple Hearts were manufactured in massive quantities, a silent acknowledgement that losses on an unprecedented scale were expected. Even today, some of those medals remain unused, a chilling artifact of how real this invasion once was. The unseen footage strips away the sanitized version of war often presented in documentaries. You see exhaustion on the faces of soldiers who hadn't yet even landed in combat. You see repetition designed to break hesitation, because hesitation on the beaches of Japan would mean death. There is no celebration, no confidence of an easy win. Only focus, discipline, and the quiet acceptance that many of these men would never come home. What makes this preparation especially haunting is how close it came to becoming reality. Dates were set. Units were assigned. Equipment was stockpiled. This was not a distant possibility. It was the next step if Japan did not surrender. The invasion was planned in phases, beginning with the southern islands and moving steadily inward. A grinding campaign that could have lasted years. Every day of delay meant more training, more planning, and more time for both sides to prepare for mutual destruction. This context changes how we understand the final months of the war. The atomic bombs did not appear in a vacuum. They emerged against the backdrop of this looming invasion, one that promised unimaginable suffering. The footage doesn't justify or condemn that decision on its own, but it explains the mindset that made it conceivable. Leaders were staring at a future where the war would not end with a single decisive battle, but with a slow, methodical consumption of human life. As the camera rolls on these training grounds, there is an eerie sense of momentum, as if history itself is leaning forward, waiting to see whether this massive machinery of war will be unleashed. These soldiers were not training for glory. They were training because the alternative was unthinkable. A war that dragged on, swallowing entire cities and generations. The invasion of Japan was the path no one wanted, but everyone feared might be unavoidable. In the end, this footage stands as a reminder of how fragile historical turning points really are. A single decision redirected millions of lives away from this invasion, freezing these preparations in time. What we're seeing is not just military training, but a world on the edge of its bloodiest chapter. rehearsing for a future that, mercifully, never arrived. What makes the unseen footage so unsettling isn't just what the soldiers are doing, but what it quietly reveals about the mindset shaping the final decisions of the war. By the time these reels were recorded, American leadership wasn't thinking in terms of victory parades or symbolic surrender ceremonies. They were thinking in terms of psychology, endurance, and damage control. The question was no longer how to defeat Japan, but how to end the war without triggering a catastrophe so vast that it would redefine human suffering for generations. The training captured on film reflects an expectation that normal rules of war would not apply. Soldiers were conditioned to assume that surrender would be rare, deception would be common, and resistance would be absolute. This wasn't paranoia. It was based on hard experience. On earlier battlefields, wounded Japanese soldiers had detonated explosives when approached, and civilians had been used as shields or combatants. The footage shows drills designed to erase hesitation, because hesitation had already proven deadly. This psychological conditioning mattered just as much as weapons or tactics, because commanders knew morale would be the true breaking point in a prolonged invasion. What's striking is how this mindset extended beyond the battlefield and into strategic decision-making. Leaders weren't simply calculating troop movements. They were weighing human limits. How long could soldiers sustain this level of violence? How many families could absorb telegrams announcing another loss? How many cities could be reduced to rubble before the war lost all meaning? The footage becomes a visual echo of those questions, showing an army bracing itself for something it deeply hoped to avoid. Behind the scenes, debates within the U.S. government were shaped by these realities. The atomic bomb is often discussed as a technological breakthrough or a display of power, but the footage reframes it as a psychological alternative to an invasion that promised endless bloodshed. Decision-makers believed that shock, sudden, overwhelming, and undeniable, might succeed where years of conventional warfare had failed. The goal was not just to defeat Japan militarily, but to break the psychological will to continue fighting, both among leaders and the population. The soldiers in the footage were not told they were preparing for a moral crossroads, yet their training embodied it. Every drill assumed worst-case scenarios, ambushes in narrow streets, civilians turning into combatants, and battles that offered no clear front lines. This blurred the distinction between soldier and civilian, turning the invasion into something closer to a total societal collapse than a traditional war. Leaders understood this, and it weighed heavily on their choices. An invasion wouldn't just be fought against an army. It would be fought against an entire nation conditioned to resist at all costs. This is where the footage becomes more than historical documentation. It becomes evidence of fear. Not cowardice, but a deep, rational fear of what modern warfare had become. The United States had industrial capacity, manpower, and momentum, but none of that guaranteed a clean ending. The footage shows that even the most powerful military in the world was preparing itself psychologically for a scenario it might not fully control. That realization challenges the simplistic narratives of strength and dominance often attached to the end of the war. When the atomic bombs were dropped, they froze these invasion plans in place. The training stopped, the dates vanished, and the soldiers returned home or prepared for occupation instead of annihilation. But the footage remains, capturing a version of history where the war continues, where beaches run red, and where victory is measured in how much suffering a nation can endure before breaking. Understanding this context doesn't erase the horror of nuclear weapons, but it explains why leaders viewed them as a lesser evil at the time. What the footage ultimately reveals is the uncomfortable truth that history's most controversial decisions are often made in moments of desperation, not clarity. There was no clean option left in 1945. Every path forward carried unimaginable consequences. The invasion promised prolonged agony. Continued bombing would devastate cities without ending resistance. Diplomacy seemed impossible through entrenched ideology. The atomic bomb, in this context, appeared as a brutal shortcut, a way to force an ending before the world collapsed under the weight of its own violence. As the film grain flickers and the soldiers move through their rehearsed motions, we are witnessing the shadow of a future that nearly was. These images remind us that peace sometimes arrives not because humanity found wisdom, but because it feared the alternative even more. The unseen footage doesn't tell us what was right or wrong. It tells us how close the world came to something far worse, and how decisions made under extreme pressure can alter the course of history forever.